Now, earlier I said that the teleological argument is one of my favorite arguments for the existence of God. And I said this because I think it shows with almost near certainty that God made the universe with life in mind, physical life. Now I'm going to be discussing the moral argument for the existence of God, and for the longest time this was one of my least favorite arguments for the existence of God. Not because it's a bad argument or anything like that, it's mostly because as I presented this argument in the past, I've often poorly explained the argument. I failed to do it justice. And so therefore, as I presented this argument, it wasn't as good as it ought to have been. However, I thought about this argument for some time and I realized, frankly, the teleological argument is a lot more difficult to understand. So if you guys got through the last presentation just fine, this is basically going to be a cakewalk. So let's see if I can actually present this argument as I ought to. Actually, speaking of ought, that's a good place to start. I think, as a baseline, we can all agree that there are certain things we ought to do and certain things we ought not to do. I think we can all agree some things are good and other things are bad. It's bad to lie, cheat, steal, and murder people, and it's good to be loving and compassionate towards others, and generous, for example. And even if someone disagreed with that assessment, it would still be wrong. Now, I don't think that's really a controversial claim by any means, but the thing is, that implies something very interesting. If we actually ought to do certain things and avoid other things, this seems to imply there is an objective standard for morality. So what does that mean? Well, it means that there is an objective standard of what behaviors are right and wrong. If you were taking a math test, for example, the person who is grading your test will use an objective standard to see if you're correct or not. They're going to look for whether or not you used the right methods and equations to answer the question, and whether your answer actually lines up with the correct answer you should have got had you used the proper methods to answer that question. And so this grader is using an objective standard in order to grade your test. And similarly with our behavior, there seems to be an objective standard being used when we judge people for doing what's wrong or commend them for doing what's right. But if morality is objective, then what is the foundation for morality? Basically, why is there an objective standard for morality? Well, what Christians and other theists will say is this. If morality is objective, then it must be grounded in some sort of necessary and transcendent source, and that source would be God. To simplify, if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. But because objective moral values and duties exist, God exists. Another way some people have put it is this. If there's an actual objective moral law that we ought to follow, a law that dictates that some things are good and other things are bad, that moral law must have a moral law giver, and that lawgiver would be God. Now, some people might obviously push back on this. They might ask a pretty reasonable question. Isn't it people and societies that ultimately determine what's right and wrong? Isn't it society that determines morality? So society is the source of morality. Well, if that is what someone claims, then all I have to say is I really hope they're wrong. And why do I say that? Well, it's because different societies had different, often incompatible moral ideas. For example, and I apologize for bringing up a very heavy topic here, but I think we can all agree that infanticide and rape are wrong. I think we would look at someone very strangely if they disagreed with that. The problem is, when you look at ancient Rome, they didn't actually hold to that same standard. In ancient Rome, if you were the man of the household, that gave you the right to do whatever you wanted with whoever you wanted in your household. Additionally, doing things like raping a slave, prostitute, prisoner of war, or even someone who wasn't a Roman citizen weren't generally considered immoral actions in the Roman Empire. Similarly with infanticide, if a mother didn't want to raise her baby, it was often quite common for her to simply leave the baby outside to die of exposure because, well, she didn't want it. And so what we often take for granted as common sense universal morals were anything but universal. And what this means is that society cannot be the foundation for morality, because otherwise, infanticide and rape would therefore be morally permissible in some societies, just not in others. Another issue with the idea that society creates morality is that moral progress would be impossible if that was actually true. Think of it this way. If societies are what create morality, then whatever the majority thinks is moral, because after all, societies are just basically collections of individuals, so it's effectively majority rule. And if that's the case, this would lead us to some pretty absurd conclusions, such as the idea that chattel slavery, eugenics, and genocide were of course morally fine, because societies accepted them at different times in their past. These things only became bad when we changed our mind about them. In the same way that, fashion trends kind of come and go, so too would moral trends come and go. Perhaps 100 years ago, or not 100, like 200 to 300 years ago, slavery was okay. Now it's not in vogue. Who knows, it might be in vogue again sometime later. Who's to say? And so therefore, moral progress wouldn't be possible if societies are what determine morality, because after all, there would be no greater standard outside of your society to actually gauge what is moral if society is what produces morality. Moral progress, therefore, only makes sense if there's an actual, ultimate, objective standard we're progressing towards. Now, like I said, I genuinely apologize for bringing up such heavy topics, but this is the moral argument. We are going to talk about very immoral things here, unfortunately. So if humans and societies aren't the foundation of morality, because obviously we can't be trusted to be the foundation, what exactly is the foundation for morality? Well, for theists, those who believe in God, the answer is obvious. If there are indeed moral facts and duties that we ought to follow, those moral facts and duties must be grounded in a necessary and unchanging being to be objectively binding. And therefore, if morality is objective, God, a necessary and unchanging being, must exist. And in fact, this is the same answer that many atheist philosophers, such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre, concluded. For instance, even if you knew absolutely nothing about Nietzsche, you've probably heard his very famous quote, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." Now the thing is, some people use this quote as a victory rallying cry for atheism, as in, we finally did it. With our rationality and science, we have finally killed that superstitious idea of God. The thing is, when Nietzsche penned this phrase, he did so with horror, sorrow, and anxiety. Because this claim that God is dead and we have killed him was never meant to be a victory cry. The point of this quote is that everything we once knew and took for granted, everything we once grounded in the nature of God, can't actually be justified if God doesn't exist. If God is dead, we can't use God to justify morality. And Nietzsche therefore believed that any form of morality that was based on Christian foundations was destined to fall apart. Because after all, if God is dead, the foundation for that morality was gone. To quote Nietzsche directly, when one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. Remember the example I gave of the Roman Empire. That morality isn't self-evident. Christianity is a system. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Even modern atheists like the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, he has noted that without God, there is no evil and no good. And so historically, atheists have actually agreed with us. If God doesn't exist, objective morality doesn't exist either, which means that morality is effectively just based on one's opinion. It doesn't actually have any bearing on whether or not something is good or bad. However, the thing is, even though for the longest time atheists have agreed with us that if God doesn't exist, objective morality can't exist, many modern atheists actually believe in objective morality. So what exactly is their foundation for this objective morality? Well, I found this very hard to believe at first, but many people claim that moral truths are simply brute facts about the universe. Basically, they claim that truths like it's wrong to torture people for fun, these are simply fixed aspects of the universe. In the same way that mathematical and logical truths are fixed aspects of the universe, so too are moral truths. In the same way that 2 + 2 = 4 is simply true, so too are moral truths simply true. To quote W.S. Morriston in his article, God and the Ontological Foundation for Morality, why are love and justice and generosity and kindness and faithfulness good? What is there in the depths of reality to make them good? My preferred answer is nothing further. If you like, you may say that they are the ultimate standard of goodness. What makes them the standard? Nothing further. Possessing these characteristics just is good-making, full stop. Now for me, this claim isn't exactly very satisfactory, and the reason for it is because this explanation for the foundation of morality is effectively a non-answer. It's the same sort of response that a tired parent might tell their child if their kid asks them, "But Mom, why is it bad that I pushed that kid over and stole his toy?" And of course, the parent would respond with, "'Cause it's just bad." In short, this explanation, as much as some philosophers do like it, it's basically just an assertion and an assumption that these moral claims are simply true, and it's an assumption that's made without explanation. Some philosophers might state that things like genocide and torture are bad in their essence, whereas love and generosity are good in their essence. And yet without God, it's very difficult to explain where this bad or good essence actually comes from. None of the obvious follow-up questions you might ask regarding this can actually be answered by the idea that some things just are good or bad. Another issue with the idea that moral truths are simply true in the same way that mathematical and logical truths are simply true is that moral truths aren't actually analogous to mathematical and logical truths. Logical truths and mathematical truths describe how things are. They describe how things actually work. For example, 2 + 2 = 4 just describes how things are. If you have 2 of one thing and add another 2, that by definition just is 4. Similarly, with logical truths, the idea that if A equals B, B must equal A is just how things are. And if A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C, just describes how things work. And the problem with trying to compare moral truths to these truths is that moral truths don't describe how things work. Claims like you shouldn't lie, cheat, and steal don't describe how things work because people do that all the time. Rather, moral truths describe how things should be. And not only that, they describe how things should be between persons. Because after all, we are morally obligated to one another. We are morally obligated to other people. You're not morally obligated to an object or to some other sort of abstract law. You are, at the end of the day, obligated to other people. Morality, at the end of the day, is all about interpersonal relationships and behaviors. And so if transcendent objective moral truths exist, that seems to very strongly imply there's a transcendent person we are obligated to. Well, not so fast. There is one last atheistic explanation for objective morality. You see, some claim that the foundation for morality comes from our shared moral intuitions that we developed via evolution. So basically, morality is a biological fact because all of us have the same common ancestor and therefore evolved the exact same moral intuitions. The main idea behind this claim is basically we evolved altruistic moral behaviors, so like loving behaviors or self-sacrificial behaviors. We evolved these sort of behaviors because these behaviors, counterintuitive as it may seem, can actually increase your fitness in a given environment. Because by being altruistic to your close relatives, this would increase the survivability of those close relatives. And because those relatives share many of your genes, it means that by being altruistic to those relatives, they are more likely to survive and reproduce, passing your genes on indirectly. And therefore, altruism would actually make you more fit in a given environment. And therefore, evolution by means of natural selection would actually select for altruistic behaviors. Altruism may have also evolved because by doing good for others, others could return the favor. If you provided food to someone when they were down on their luck, they might do the same for you when you're down on your luck. And that would increase your survivability and reproduction, which is what evolution at the end of the day ultimately cares about. And therefore, because our evolution can explain these moral intuitions we have, that would mean that we have a basis for objective morality, because biology transcends culture. And because all of us are human at the end of the day, that would mean we have an objective basis. Now, some might want to object to this by saying that we don't know if this evolutionary story is actually true. However, I actually want to take a very different approach to this. I want to show you that even if we assume all of this is true, that we evolved over millions of years to have our moral intuitions, that doesn't actually give us a basis for objective morality. So for the rest of this presentation, assume that this story is true. Now, why is it that even if this is true, it can't provide us a basis for objective morality? Well, the reason evolution can't give us a basis for objective morality is because of the context in which altruism would have evolved. Altruism would have evolved when we were organized into very small groups made up almost entirely of our own extended family. This would mean that everyone who we would be altruistic towards would effectively be related to us. And therefore, by being altruistic towards them, that would increase our fitness indirectly. And this is because, of course, our relatives share our genes. And if that is the case, then this evolutionary explanation for morality doesn't actually give us any reason to believe we should be altruistic towards those outside of our immediate family. Because after all, doing that was never the purpose of altruism. It was all about helping your own family. And so there's no reason to actually be good towards those outside of your family if this explanation is true. Behaviors like giving to a charity or risking your life to save someone you don't know, these sorts of behaviors could only make sense under our evolutionary model if we assumed they were evolutionary flukes. Let me explain using a different biological mechanism. Humans tend to prefer sugary and fatty foods compared to other foods. And one of the reasons for that is because these foods are very rich in calories. And because we can store calories in the form of fat, preferring these sorts of sugary and fatty foods actually would have given us a very good survival advantage in the distant past. Because by eating and preferring these foods, it would give you the excess calories you need to store as fat, which you could then utilize later on when food is scarce. So there's a very good evolutionary explanation for why we'd prefer these sorts of foods. However, in our modern world, our desire for sugary and fatty foods can often be quite detrimental, mainly because consuming too many of them can lead to things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, atherosclerosis, and numerous other health issues. And so what we see here is that we have a biological inclination to eat certain foods. And while that inclination might have helped us in the distant past to survive, it might have helped our ancestors survive, well, it seems to have outlived its usefulness today. And the same could very easily be said about our moral values if they were simply derived from our evolutionary history. If we developed these things when we lived in small tribes as a way of basically increasing our fitness, it would indicate that basically, well, our moral intuitions don't really have any bearing on how we are today. In short, even if we evolved biological intuitions that certain things are moral, that wouldn't actually make them moral. It wouldn't tell us whether we should actually act on those intuitions, because at the end of the day, our biology only dictates what's beneficial for survival and reproduction. There's, of course, tons of other issues with the idea that morality has a basis in biology, but given my passion for biology, you could probably imagine I'd be able to spend the entire talk just talking about the issues with this theory alone. So I'm going to stop myself right there. If you do want to know some of the other issues with this theory, though, feel free to ask about it during the question period. So if none of these foundations for objective morality work, what else is there to actually explain the reality of objective moral values and duties? Well, what about what I've been suggesting this entire time? If objective moral facts and duties exist, God exists. And it actually makes a lot of sense that objective morality would have its foundation in God the more you think about it. If morality is objective, it means that certain things would be immoral or moral no matter what we think. Basically, even if people in the past thought certain immoral behaviors like infanticide and exploitation were okay, that doesn't actually make them okay. Those things were still wrong even when people were mistaken about them, much like how an entire classroom could very feasibly get a math problem wrong, but that wouldn't actually change the answer of that math problem. So we see here that morality is objective, but additionally, because we can know what is moral through rational means, we can rationally determine whether or not something is moral or immoral, and because morality is all about interpersonal interactions, that seems to indicate that whatever the foundation for morality is, it must be rational and capable of interpersonal interactions, meaning it would therefore be sentient. And so, moral facts and duties therefore must be grounded in a necessary, unchanging, transcendent, sentient source. And that source is what we would call God, because those traits are what we've always ascribed to God. In fact, this conclusion for the moral argument makes a lot of sense given what Stephen talked about earlier regarding the cosmological argument, because there we realized we needed some sort of necessary, unchanging being for the universe to exist, and therefore we would have very good grounds to ground morality in that same necessary, unchanging being. The conclusion of the moral argument also very naturally follows given what I discussed earlier with the teleological argument. Because if God fine-tuned the universe for life, that seems to imply he is sentient and has an affinity for life. So, we have very good reason to ground morality, something that only applies to living things, in that same sentient, life-loving, necessary being that was implied to exist by the teleological argument. And so given all of this, given that the cosmological argument and teleological argument kind of naturally lead into the moral argument, it's pretty safe to say that if objective morals exist, if good and evil actually exist, God exists. Now, I do want to finish this talk by clearing up some misconceptions about this argument because there are a few that people often bring. The first thing I want to clarify is this. My argument is not that only theists can be moral, nor am I saying that theists, or those who believe in God, are better than atheists. Atheists can be moral, and in fact, there's probably plenty of atheists who are more moral than many Christians, which is, frankly, something we should be ashamed about, but still. At the same time, my argument isn't that God exists because Christians are better than atheists or more moral than atheists. That is not my argument. My argument is that without God, you can't justify where the standard for objective morality actually comes from. My argument is that atheism can't provide a foundation for an objective standard of morality, whereas theism can. Atheists can still do good things, and they can still be good in general. They just can't justify why good and evil actually exist. Another objection I sometimes hear when people use this argument is, quote unquote, hey, I don't need the Bible to know what's right and wrong. Or as some people might put it, you don't need religion to have morals. If you can't determine right from wrong, then you lack empathy, not religion. And the thing is, this is also misunderstanding the argument I'm making. And that should probably be very clear to all of you because I didn't quote the Bible once to make my point. You see, I'm not claiming that you need to read the Bible or that you need to believe in God to know that there is a right and wrong, or to do that which is right and avoid that which is wrong. At the end of the day, the moral argument doesn't talk about how we know what is moral. That's why I said the evolutionary argument could actually still work with the moral argument, because even if we developed our moral intuitions via evolution, that tells us nothing about whether our moral intuitions are actually right. You see, I'm not talking about how we know what is right and wrong. I'm talking about the very nature of morality itself. The fact that there actually is a good and evil to speak of. You can know what is right and wrong without appealing to God, in the same way that I can know that 2 + 2 = 4 without actually appealing to a mathematical proof for that. But in both of these cases, you need an actual foundation to show that these things are true. And that's where God comes into the picture when it comes to morality. Actually, Stephen summarized this argument in the best way I've heard when he originally asked me to give a presentation on this argument. His very basic and provocative summary of the argument is this: God exists because evil exists. You can know that good and evil exist without believing in God. Yes, that is true. However, good and evil can't exist if God doesn't exist. I actually really love the way you phrased that, because I was reflecting on this argument a while back, and I realized, when I look back on my story as a Christian, I think one of the very first arguments I ever made to show that God exists was actually based on the existence of evil. I effectively deduced, okay, if evil actually exists, God needs to exist. Mind you, I of course formulated that argument over a decade ago, so it wasn't nearly as robust and complex as the argument I gave today, but I was 13 at the time, cut me some slack. Now, like with all my talks, there's of course a lot I didn't get to cover, including a section on Euthyphro's dilemma. But if you want to hear more, please feel free to ask about that stuff during the question period. Additionally, if you want more resources on this argument, I cannot recommend enough Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. This book basically spends the first 30 pages or so just on the moral argument, and he explains it in a way that I've never heard before, so it's worth the read if you want more on that. Additionally, I would also highly recommend God's Crime Scene by J. Warner Wallace. He goes over a lot of the objections to this argument in a lot more detail than I did. Additionally, if you want some videos on the topic, if you're not much of a reader, which I don't blame you, I'm not either, I can also suggest plenty of those. With that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Stephen to give you the remaining arguments for God's existence.